Hello, everyone. We are setting up the Facebook live stream so you all can see us, but the Facebook people can't. So give us a second here to get this working. Because technology is a thing now.
Okay.
Let's light this candle.
Let's light this.
There we go. Ta-da.
Already live on Facebook.
And click that and good evening, viewers around the world. Welcome to our 21st COVID cast, our 21st weekly town hall in the age of COVID-19. My name's John Daw. I am your digital producer tonight. I'm joined tonight by Karen, Terry, and of course, Dr. Sanjay Ghoshi. Hi, everyone. Happy 21st birthday. Because it's our 21st birthday, we're just gonna, we can drink now. So we're just gonna update this here as, oh wait, that's not right. That's not right. Hold on. It's Sanjay, so.
John.
And with that, have a great show, everyone. I will be in the control room, apparently drinking hydroxychloroquine from a beer bottle. Okay, bye.
Take care, John. Thank you for the intro. Thanks for setting us all up as usual every week. Thanks for everyone who has joined us. I see a lot of names that we interact with on the resource page and on my personal page. I'm really happy to see you guys. Thanks for joining. So this week we have Dr. JJ Rasimas who will be joining us. And because he is a frontline clinical worker, he is actually running a few minutes behind. So we're going to talk about a few things as he sets up and gets ready to join us. So last week, we talked about a number of issues that are really points of pain for the country as a whole right now. And what we wanted to do with Dr. Rasimas is have him talk to us about the decision-making process around a number of different parameters and choices that we're faced with in this era. And the kind of insights that he can probably give us in terms of what he sees with people that he is treating, and also that he, as an observer in society with the clinical background of psychiatry, has been able to glean from different behaviors. I have some specific questions for him, so I'm really going to be more of a attendee, and he's going to take us through his thinking and some of his observations. The reason we wanted him to come back, and one of the reasons he offered to come back, is that we're seeing a lot of disinformation continue to be pervasive. And that disinformation, in my opinion, is prolonging the pandemic here in the United States. I look at the countries in Asia and the European Union that have largely brought this pandemic under control. There will be outbreaks and news of certain setbacks as they continue to reopen their economies and their societies. So as we talked about in the past town halls, information that came from Israel around their attempt to get kids back in school and how that went poorly for them in a couple of examples. Um, in Europe, obviously it's summertime and people want to be out and enjoy themselves. And so there are reports of outbreaks or rising case counts in vacation towns or towns surrounding vacation areas in Spain, Portugal, France, Italy. But none of them are comparable to the kind of massive rise in numbers that we saw from around the first week of June and continuing into this week. So we called it the resurgence. Terry, Karen, and I have been covering this now for, as John said, 21 weeks. And about 5 weeks ago, we determined that there was a resurgence. And really that was driven by people's behavior and the choices that they were making. They were consuming news just like all the rest of us do, but a certain segment of society has become very prone to adopting a contrarian stance to the public health recommendations, and they either don't take them very seriously, and therefore their behavior reflects that, or they, as a demographic, for example, young people, feel that they are healthy enough that if they get sick, there will be no major consequences. So, and Terry, I think you have three categories, right, Terry? You have the ones that are really like politically driven and kind of contrarian based on that kind of political bent. Then you have the young people that seem unconcerned or seem invincible.
Third,
I don't remember the third. That was what I was going to ask you.
anti-vaxxers.
Okay, that's right. Yes. So and you said that it's driven largely by the political left,
Yeah.
the anti-vaxxers that have found strange bedfellows in the far right
Yeah.
as contrarians to public health advice. So that's what we wanted Dr. Rasimas, JJ, to join us and talk to us about. So Karen, if you see his name pop up, just let me know. The topics that I want him to talk to us about are, is there a reluctance or distrust of testing, the numbers, the disinformation about either inflation of numbers and the severity of cases in their location. We have a strange anomaly in the data in Texas right now, that there's a testing, a drop in testing capacity or tests performed of about 46% in the last week, and we're trying to figure out whether that is causing a rapid rise in the percentage positivity, or is that just obfuscating a potential surge upon the surge in Texas. So
Since you mentioned Texas,
yeah.
do you remember at one point we said not to believe anything you hear out of Florida?
Yes.
Okay. So now don't believe anything you hear out of Florida, Texas, or Arizona.
Yeah, that's the problem. So if there is such enormous and growing distrust of the numbers, and it has nothing to do with politics. It's just, it doesn't matter what your politics.
There's nothing to explain how the numbers are going in Texas. There's no reasonable way to break it down.
Yeah, because I was alerted to this by Mike Kidd.
I saw that.
Yeah, and so we had a brief discussion about that. It just it doesn't make sense. Like there shouldn't be a precipitous drop in percentage positive and then a rebound like that. That will only happen, like I said, is if you come up over the last 4 to 5 weeks. It will take 4 to 5 weeks for the curve to come down. It doesn't drop like this unless we're dealing with a Ebola type of disease that kills very quickly, and then doesn't, because it kills very quickly, it precludes a further spread.
No matter what the testing numbers are doing, the death count is still going up.
Correct. Yes. So there's a big discrepancy in numbers, and that leads to further public distrust. So if the numbers are wrong and whoever's putting out the numbers are manipulative or sloppy, then it undermines trust in anyone talking to the public about recommendations and guidance and things like that. It just, you know what I'm saying? Like, it feels like we're being lied to. So why should I take anything seriously? And that has nothing to do with that can be felt by the left or the right.
California, they undercounted by hundreds of thousands.
Yes,
so that's breaking out now that they ran on the information technology that the governor pushed up to this point, and through I guess someone stumbled upon the fact that they were down 300,000
cases
Yes.
uncounted. Oh, yeah. So because of that, a lot of us that are monitoring multiple sites are seeing, if the count should be within, like Gail Barron mentioned last time, and I didn't understand what she was saying. The counts across different reporting websites should be within a margin of error, right? They should be within one or two maximum, 1 or 2% of each other. They're now differing by 5 to 8 to 9%, which means that all of their information is either not coming to them in a timely manner, and so they're not calculating them at the same time, which could be a possibility, or there's all kinds of other weirdness happening. Mike mentioned that some labs are not reporting their negatives. Why are you not reporting your negatives? Well, they're saying that they're getting backlogged and their IT systems are getting to a point where they can't push out all of their reports, so they're reporting only on the positives right now.
A big warning sign that I have noticed, and I don't know if you guys have had this experience, is we start to see videos, Facebook Live videos from healthcare people in the hotspots as the hotspots move around the country, right?
Yes.
And now I started following this nurse Eric from Phoenix because Phoenix was hot. And then when Minneapolis was hot, I started seeing all these posts from Minneapolis nurses. So I see like a lot of activism coming from nurses and doctors that are working in these clinics and hospitals.
Yeah, because we have all the time in the world to start, sharing clinical information while taking care of, dozens of critically ill patients.
Yeah, they're doing it in their car on the way home from the shift because they're so desperate to get the word out that they'll do anything.
I showed you guys last week in one corner of the start screen. Let me show you again. I'll share my screen. There's a symptom map. It's in coordination with Facebook, oddly enough. And so what this symptom map is showing, oh, I'm not sharing it. Hold on. Okay, so what this symptom map is showing is people, I don't know how they're culling this data, probably some violation of privacy is involved here, but people who are reporting that they feel ill. And this actually is a few days ahead of case counts. If you can imagine, if you start feeling ill, then you go get tested. So look at the South, of the 27.9 million people in Texas, of those people that they're able to get any information off of, about 1% are feeling ill. That's a hell of a lot of people. It's 200,000 people. So then that's across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and then Florida. And so this looks like there's a surge on a surge. And I don't know why. It may be inaccurate, but look out here in Nevada, again, people with symptoms, that's a lot of people. It's very unscientific, and
Sanjay, where's the data coming from? The people with symptoms, like clinics, or are they Googling it, or?
You know what? I don't know.
Remember there was that thermometer company that is
yes, the blue, yeah,
that was fascinating.
Yeah. I should look into it a little bit more closely, but it seems like it's based on surveys. Learn about the surveys and the map data. I guess it's surveys. University of Maryland with Carnegie Mellon. I don't know. You know what, guys? I will look into this more and get back to you. So, but clearly, like, I've been looking at that and then trying to compare it to the case counts and the things that we are seeing in very specific areas, like hotspots within Texas. You can see that certain counties are quite hot, and that may show that's going to increase percent positivity in the next few days. Here's JJ. We've got him. So we're going to promote to panelist, and then John, are you there to put up?
Yep.
Can you put up JJ's slide? There he is. Hi, JJ. And we'll have to unmute JJ.
Oh.
Okay. All right. So I have posted Dr. Rasimas's brief CV along with the invitation. So I don't want to waste a lot of time because his accomplishments are long. I just want to say that he's one of the smartest people I've ever known in my life. And having him join us and take your questions is really quite a privilege for all of us. So I will let JJ take it from here. And I just want to make sure that you all know that we have this in a webinar format because we have a much larger number of attendees than we used to when we started. So obviously use the chat as you wish, but the Q&A panel will allow us to collate questions. Karen and Terry and myself will try to synthesize questions that come from different people but have a similar topical area. And then as we go along, and where appropriate to interrupt Dr. Rasimas, we will interject those questions. And then we hope to have a longer Q&A session at the end of his talk. Does that sound okay, JJ?
It does. I'm going to do my best to try not to talk too long straight because the internet was not made for long attention span kinds of activities. And so yes. Dialogue is better anyway. And so I'm going to try to hold to that as best I can. And okay, so great. Interrupting in the middle is even better for people's engagement and attention. And then I really do want to leave time on the back end.
Okay, great. Great. Let's switch over to JJ as the presenter. Perfect. Great to see you.
All right, good stuff. So what you've got is my face here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to sharing either screen or the software. I have a question for you folks, actually. Do you think that sharing screen and then running the PowerPoint on my screen works better, or sharing the actual application of PowerPoint works better? Have you found that one works better than the other when you do this?
You should start the presentation in PowerPoint and then share the presentation, not the actual application.
Yes.
share
Yeah,
the
so I would
present.
just share out of PowerPoint instead of your whole screen. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. That's what I thought. All right, I'm gonna do my best to try to manage all the windows and stuff like that. One of the things that you realize when you do these things too is that there isn't a good way to be able to see your own lecture notes. And so, like if you have dementia, like I may very well, if you want to see what notes you made for yourself, you actually have to do a 2-screen sort of a deal.
Oh,
So
yes.
so I have my desktop POS Mac running very, very slowly, trying to catch up to this for my lecture notes. And so I just wanted to make sure I had that. All right, so we got a side-by-side thing going on.
Great.
Okay, who can share? Yeah. Oops. Wait a minute. Come on, buddy. I wish I could multitask well enough to ramble about myself in an amusing way at the same time that I'm fighting the tech, but it doesn't quite work out that way. Okay, tell me what you see.
Yes. You're all good, JJ.
You got slides. Beautiful.
Yes. Good.
All right, I'm going to get my own mug out of my own face so that I can see what I'm talking about. I'll do my best. Thanks so much, Sanjay, again, for the opportunity to join the group. We talked about the experience of being embedded in the hospital situation before. I'm still doing the same thing, so I can open in a way with an apology for my somewhat unprofessional appearance, in the sense that you are not, you don't need to adjust your monitor for the color of my hair. I've done this because we spend all of our time covering up our faces, and I'm a psychiatrist, and I have to tell you, it has become more and more challenging to have resonant relationships with people in care settings the way that I had taken for granted before, now that we can't see each other's facial reactions. And so I can't fix that. You may have seen some of the footage from lots of places where people have big buttons or big pictures of themselves pasted to their gear, their PPE, to try to put a human face on the situation. So at least the person they're caring for knows some sense of who the person is, but that still photo really doesn't cut it. So the blue hair is actually an attempt to try to add something striking for people to remember, for very stressed staff in the hospital to be able to recognize from a distance. And so if they need the psychiatrist, they know who it is because they can recognize the shrink all the way down the hall, and they can yell for input or whatever they want. And honestly, I joke about it being like I'm kind of a walking antidepressant these days, because sometimes people just look at me and they sort of chuckle because it's strange, and it snaps them out of the difficult headspace that a lot of folks are in every day trying to do this work in the hospital. I'm in a fortunate spot because I don't wear PPE solid, sort of encapsulated in it from beginning to end of shift in a way that I can't ever get out, with high exposure risks and things like that. But I am a medical hospital embedded psychiatrist. So I wander around the hospital setting, helping out with the experience of being medically ill on the part of the patient herself, the team taking care of her, the nurses at the bedside, all of the other folks. And so it has really been a very stressful but true privilege to be dealing with the effect of the pandemic on an acute hospital in its medical and surgical beds, not in the psychiatric beds, but in the medical and surgical space. I've learned a great deal. We're still learning as we go, as Sanjay tells you through his sharing of information as best he can every week, the reality that there are many unanswered questions. And every time we get something like an answer to a question, it spawns 50 more. And there's an urgency to answer the question faster than we ever have before with this particular problem. This is part of the reason why we are begging for assistance from the public as partners in the work, truly in the work itself of trying to take care of each other and help out. And so that's really part of why Sanjay wanted me to talk about this particular title. It's this topic that you see highlighted in my title there, because we are not in a spot where we have the easy, ready to hand fix that really our society often hopes, wishes, expects that we have in medicine, this sort of transactional setup where we have this, doctor, I have a problem. Thank you very much for sharing that with me. Tell me more. I'd like to do these tests. Here's what I think it is. Here are your options. Would you like to do this? Oh, yes, please relieve my problem. Thank you very much. And at the end of the transaction, some sort of payment occurs, whether it's, you know, an insurance-based thing or some other wrinkle of the American health system. But this pandemic obviously stresses us in ways that we haven't been ready for. And so this question of whether or not we are able to see this really big, like if it's a Sisyphean task, this big rock that we all need to try to push up the hill, can we find a way to all get on the same side of it so that we can move it, rather than this horrible thing that happens when a problem is so big that it encompasses our entire worldview from the perspective that we have, and we can't see around it. So oftentimes we're pushing in a way that literally there's somebody else on the other side of the rock pushing the opposite direction. Neither of us can see each other, and we're having a terrible time. And as a result, you know, to extend the metaphor, the rock is rolling back and forth and crushing each other's feet, or going off to the side and running over some other people we never intended to hurt. So the idea is that it would really be helpful if we could find a way to have some kind of solidarity on the issue of what we all should be trying to do now. Recognizing the fact that there are differences between and among us, recognizing the fact that there are differences between and among our communities, and that we have to be flexible, and that sameness or solidarity or singleness of purpose does not mean the same action every time in every place for every person. But there are big picture issues that spark debate. And I guess I can lay the framework now. One of the obvious ones is the question of whether or not we have folks willing to do the basic work of trying to cut down on spread by attending to basic hygiene for themselves and following guidance about not gathering too closely and trying to keep the virus out of the air by putting up barriers on our faces, whether or not we're willing or able to do it. So I'd like you to have, I mean, you already have this in mind. You wouldn't be in this forum if you didn't already have those issues in mind as you're coming to this. But I give you that as the background to something I'm going to talk about that maybe at the beginning of it doesn't really feel like it's directly focused on COVID or focused on these problems. But I'm hoping that at stages along the way, if you'd like to cut in and talk about it and raise an issue that brings us back, or at least by the end, you'll have some things to say, think about, and maybe even decide to do for yourself or in your communities that have something to do with these more general concepts I'm going to talk about how people make decisions, in ways that we have already studied in more general ways, thinking about how they might apply specifically to the situation. So that's the background. Any particular concerns or anything, it's probably a good place to pause. I cannot see the chat as we go because I can't keep that window up at the same time, but I see the numbers coming up. So Sanjay or anybody else at the panelist moderator level, anything to say before I actually launch into content?
No, JJ, you're good to go. We're just talking to the attendees to get them to put their questions in, and then find out when we can get in to ask you. But you can go ahead and start. Thank you.
That sounds great. Thanks so much. Okay, so here we go. See if I can get my clicking going right. All right, so I prepare talks like this, under a certain framework. And so just so we're clear, like I'm not going to be talking about drugs or any treatments that you think I could make money on, but I don't have any financial interest, or I don't get anything out of thinking about the concepts that we're going to talk about in any substantive way. This is just my own stuff and for you to have to put up with. So maybe someone will want to type the answer into the chat really fast, or raise a hand or scream out the answer. But this is the starting point, I think, that we should actually use if we're going to talk about what we might hope people will do, or what we might ask people to do, or offer them as an option for how to manage the problem of whatever the medical issue is. And in this case, we're talking about the virus, potential risk of contracting it, spreading it, et cetera. This has medical relevance. And so medical people have this in mind, at least somewhere in their minds, based on the training that they've had, that they know that there's something special about medicine and what we ask of people, what we do with them, what we do to them, that allows things to occur within the hospital or within healthcare relationships that, if they happened in another context, would not be permissible. This is the reason why we take the concept of truly informing people and having their reliable consent to guide what happens as paramount, as central to the operation. Because if it's not, think about it, right? Somebody comes at you with a piece of sharpened steel, slices open your belly, pulls something out, stitches it back up, and says, go sit over there for a while and take this medicine. If somebody did that to you at the bus station, you would be calling for assistance and you would have them in court faster than they could say Jack Johnson. So there's something special about medicine that says we have got to have a framework for how we approach this in order to do it properly. Otherwise, it's absolutely not acceptable. And so I'm hoping that as I say these things out loud, you're constantly sort of bouncing your brain back to the problem of the pandemic. Oh yeah, like if we literally like held somebody down and forced them to have a mask on their head and then sent them on their way without them having some sort of understanding of the situation and their buy-in, yeah. Even if you might really like the guy over there to wear a mask for his sake, for your sake, for everybody's sake, it would be assault to literally force him to physically do it, right? Makes sense conceptually. So this is part of the reason why we have to think in more complex terms, get creative, have working relationships together, et cetera, in order to tackle this issue. So where does this come from? Well, I mean, the ethical background of this makes sense, right? This is really medicine's expression of a more general ethical doctrine of respect for persons. Respect for persons is actually a phrase that is repeated many times over in the Belmont Report and the Helsinki Report, these basic big documents that we've put together in response to previous missteps in what medicine has done to people in history and what medical research has proposed to do to people. So respect for persons is critical. Ethically, it means that as long as you have the capability to be informed and give consent, it is important for us in medicine. It is central, it is required of us that we allow folks to make those choices. And from a legal standpoint, basically society says by default, every adult has the ability to make this decision for himself, for herself, unless there's really compelling evidence that they don't have that ability. And you got to prove it, right? So it's, akin to, in a way, innocent until proven guilty. This would be able to make decisions for oneself until truly proven unable to do so. The key is, though, that people do need to be capable, truly capable of making a medical decision. And this is another place where then doctors who are really doing their work diligently have a duty to check on something. Is the person in front of you someone who is actually capable of being informed, right? So we have this starting point of informed consent grounds the way that we do our work. But the individual in question has to have the capacity to be informed in order to consent. I hope that makes sense. Basic, right? Like if you cannot be informed in a basic way about what the situation is, the medical situation, then to be able to consent to something medical doesn't follow as even a possibility for you. So how do doctors look at this? Well, in specific terms, although we take a lot of this for granted, just like our courts, our legal system, our society assumes that adults have these abilities in general terms, specific to the medical situation, we tend to assume that unless someone is demonstrating a clear problem in one of these areas, we guess that people can do this. So we don't go around literally every time we have a new thing to ask, Ma'am, would you like me to put this Band-Aid on your finger? Sir, would you like to take this antibiotic? Ma'am, would you like to think about this surgery that might correct your hip problem? We don't literally every time go through this process of deeply assessing, now, do you understand what I'm talking about? Really in detail. Do you get the medical consequences of the situation? Meaning, if we leave this untreated, my medical opinion is this is what's likely to happen. So if you don't do this, fill in as you're cognating on this, wear a mask. What is likely to occur if you do or do not do this? Can you tell me how the choices that I'm putting forth to you fit with what you want for yourself? What are your values? What are you wanting for an outcome for your life? And can you take the information that I've given you and put that information up against what you're hoping your outcomes will be so that you can make a choice? And then make a choice and stick with it. And that's actually an important one, even though it doesn't feel like it is. But like if you have someone who says, sure, I'll have surgery, you do all those preparations, you start wheeling that person down the hall into the surgery theater, and then they scream and say, no, 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 don't do it. You say, okay, my gosh, we're not going to assault you with a scalpel if you don't want. You go back, you talk about it, and the person says, oh yeah, I want surgery. And you say, but wait a minute, we just went, what did you? No, 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 I really want surgery. So you get all the wheels of the bus going again, and you do it the next morning, and the person, as they're going down the hall, says, no, 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 don't do it again. So if someone consistently is inconsistent in a way that they can't meet that fourth criterion, that also means that they don't have capacity to be able to follow through as their own decision maker. The most important thing that we think about is every one of these assessments, even though we don't stop and do one every single time in painstaking detail, every time it is actually about a specific thing. Meaning, if I have this little cut on my finger, which I got by getting too close to our bread knife a couple of weeks ago, and someone says, you know, I like the idea of cleaning this thing out for you and putting a little bit of ointment on it and a Band-Aid. Think it would be useful? Prevents infection? What do you think? That I may very well understand that situation and be willing to submit to the ER doc who will do that for me. And I may understand all of the relevant information, be able to go through these four criteria. But what if I have a genetic condition that renders me unable to have a heart that will sustain me for much longer in my life? And the proposal is to pull the one out of my chest that I've got and replace it with a new one. That is obviously a much more complex situation than a cut on my finger. So it is quite possible that I might be able to display capacity for making a decision about getting a Band-Aid put on, but I may not have the wherewithal to understand all of the ins and outs of what happens with a cardiac surgery. I might not be able to meet that standard to be able to make my own choice about how that goes. So again, level of complexity, thinking about what that means related to the pandemic and choices around one's own medical health, and also the uncertainty that we've got, right? Like we've got a lot of history around cutting your finger and not cleaning it up, not a good thing. Cleaning it up, bandaging it, good thing. Lots of outcomes that sort of tells us pretty certainly the risk-benefit analysis around this weighs in favor of just clean the thing up. Probably a good idea. The risk-benefit analysis around that cardiac surgery, much more complex, but we have a history of understanding what kind of hearts are likely to be able to keep going, what kinds of hearts are likely to fail and how soon. And so we have pretty good predictive analyses around that we can then deliver to patients so that they can make decisions for themselves. Maybe not in all the gory detail that a cardiologist needs to know. After all, there's a little bit more schooling involved than that than it is to just be the patient. But you see where I'm going with this. What happens in a world of uncertainty where we do not truly know enough details about the medical situation around the virus to be able to then translate that into a package that people can make decisions about? What does that mean to the limitations that people might have around their ability to make a medical choice? It gets tricky already. All right, so let's go one step further. Although it's not built into those four principles that I told you are like, you know, these are the pillars, those four concepts that I had on the previous slide. They're the four pillars of what defines whether or not someone can make their own choice. But then there's a wrinkle. Practically speaking, as I was kind of suggesting with that Band-Aid versus cardiac surgery analogy, we do practically, operationally in medicine, have a kind of a sliding scale that guides how much we expect of people. Because honestly, if we had a long sit down, hum down, drug out talk about every Band-Aid, medical practice would grind to a halt because we don't have enough time to be able to spend on that kind of analysis every time. So that's one of the reasons practically why we have this kind of a setup. And so I'm going to show you a chart that at first may not seem intuitive, because it seems like, well, you know, whether somebody chooses to go with what a doctor suggests or doesn't choose to go with what a doctor suggests, what seems to be the most recommended, the best, highest recommended pathway for a given situation, it shouldn't really matter whether or not they say yes or say no, should it? Like conceptually, if you're telling me those 4 principles, if you meet them, you get to choose. You get to choose yes, you get to choose no, it doesn't matter. So that may seem like that's true on the surface, but consider this situation. Look at the risk-benefit analysis in relation to the reality of making a medical decision. So I've cut open my finger, very, very dirty wound, deep, full of bugs, right? Likely to get infected if left the way that it is. Doctor says to me, look, I have this really beneficial thing I can do for you. I can wash this thing out very, very thoroughly. I can examine it. I can make sure we sort of stitch it back together so that your finger heals up properly. I can cover it so that you don't have trouble with it going forward, and you'll end up with a really nice outcome. We've done this so many times in medicine. I've done this so many times that I can basically promise you that things will go really, really well, and they are very, very unlikely to cause you trouble. So in that situation, doesn't it make sense that if someone is going to say, yeah, sure, take care of my finger, we shouldn't ask very much of them to be able to tell us why they're accepting it, right? It makes sense. We've got a lot of background to tell us this would be really helpful. We don't have a lot of risk. And so for someone to say, yeah, sure, you know, we're not going to make them meet a very, very high standard to accept that kind of a treatment. But what if the calculus is the same? Really high benefit, very low risk, and a patient says, nah, no thanks. I think it's probably worth pausing, and so does the medical ethical community, says it's really worth pausing and listening to that patient and saying, could you flesh out for me in a little more detail why it is that you don't want this? I want to hear how your mind works on this before we decide that it's okay for you to let this go. Because I got to tell you, this could be really serious. Now, that's the other thing, is how serious is it? So if you decide to let a finger get infected, likely not the end of the world, noting that there are possibilities for something that you can do about it later, probably. It may be less comfortable, there may be more issues, but in the grand scheme of things, if you let that patient walk out without having treatment done, it's probably not going to be the end of the world. So we tend not to have, you know, out and out fights and have a throwdown about a situation where somebody can't meet that threshold. But we do at least want to hear how their mind works before we say, okay, you can say no to the Band-Aid. What about the opposite situation? What about a situation where, like, you've got a horrible cancer, really nasty one, on diagnosis, it's everywhere, there really isn't much to offer, but you can, if you would like to, subject yourself to really serious chemotherapy in order to try to endure it. And what does it offer? It offers maybe your life will last a little bit longer. It's probably not going to be a very nice life because you're going to be burdened with heavy side effects. But if time is what you value, then there may be a little bit of a benefit, but it's not going to extend your life much, maybe a month, maybe 2. So in that situation, low treatment benefit, really high treatment risk, like almost guaranteed brutal side effects from all these medications. If somebody's going to consent to that, we really want to hear how their mind works, that they want to accept something like that. Make sense, right? So we outline all of the nuts and bolts of what it would be like to have all these terrible poisons given to you regularly just to try to extend your life a little bit. But what if your reasoning is, you know what? I've got a kid in high school. She is 3 months away from graduating, and I absolutely have to see her walk across the stage. There's just no, like, this is my life. It's what I've lived to see. These milestones are the most important thing to me. My own life, my own comfort are less important to me than this accomplishment for her, and I need the best chance possible to be there. And if you're telling me there's a really good chance that I'll be dead before she graduates if I don't have chemo, but even with this brutal chemo, I've got a shot at being there, I want it. It's always been the way that I've been wired. My life is my family. It's my kids. So sign me up. It sounds like this is a person who has a set of values that fit directly with what he is saying he wants done to him, for him, however you want to frame it. And so as long as he can articulate that, he meets a very high threshold. He's sharing his mind in detail. We will let him go forward. But if somebody in that same situation says, Doc, no thanks, lots of poisons for a horrible life that lasts only a little bit longer, I don't need that kind of suffering, high risk, low benefit, we don't tend to spend a heck of a lot of time making sure that people really tell us all the details of their calculus in their mind about it. So I hope you're in your mind sort of, checking some boxes and thinking like, okay, so what is the public health panel of expertise in our country and across the world asking of us related to COVID? Is it high risk or low risk to wear a mask? Is it high benefit or low benefit to wear a mask? What are we asking for? Okay, so now here's where I'm going to make the shift and see if there are still some interesting things that you think are actually worth talking about relevant to the situation. The one thing, and I see the chat's kind of blowing up, and maybe people are writing about this in the background already. You may already have this thing in your mind that you're concerned about, and you should be. What is really different about the management of the COVID epidemic and all of what we might ask people to do? What is different about that as compared to this rubric that I've been outlining about how medical decisions are made and how we assess people's capacity to make them and how we let them go forward without worrying about their decision making? The key difference in that situation, in these situations as compared to the pandemic, is what we're having most of our debates about are about what an individual person does to or for himself by engaging in a particular activity, right? So we've spent a fair bit of time wondering about how much a mask might protect me or how much my own hand washing might protect me from contracting the disease. But the more we've learned going forward, it's become pretty clear that these activities, these actions that we're asking people to engage in with physical distancing and mask wearing especially, is really much more about protecting the other rather than the self. And all this other stuff that I've been rambling about up to this point has been about medical decision-making around what do I want for me? What risk and benefit might I incur by going down this pathway versus that pathway? So this is one of the reasons why medicine itself is struggling mightily with what to do, because we don't, within medicine itself, actually have a framework for working through this with individual patients who do or do not like what we give for advice, who may or may not take guidance, because the guidance calculation when we make the recommendation as health experts is much less about that individual in front of us and much more about the other people they come in contact with. So this is the background from where we start, but it makes it tough to extend it going forward. Yes, Sanjay, good time to break in.
Okay, so yeah, just to I guess synthesize my own thoughts with some of the conversation and one of the questions that David Thomas brought up, that this, now we're moving on to a scenario where the information that we present to the patient for their own decision making is a shared decision between the clinician or the care team and that person. When we shift to public health rather than the individual, then we're looking at trying to provide education along the lines of what would be the detrimental actions of not pursuing a recommended course of, behavior or action or treatment recommendation. So for me, like you said, if I have cancer, I can say, and you tell me I've got 3 months, but you can make that 6 months if you go on this chemo, but you're going to have to not be able to go and do certain things in public. Okay. That means go to my daughters or et cetera, like you just explained. Then it's a very personal decision based on a motivation around what I have weighed are important to me, right? When you are now giving a person a choice as to the consequences of their, I've informed you, I have educated you, and now your behavior is going to be based on your choice. Are you going to, the key point I'm trying to make here is it's no longer an individual downstream. It's now a collective downstream. And so and we'll get back to David's question towards the end because it's not really appropriate now. He wanted to know on a capacity if the patient isn't able to consent. We have a bunch of rules around that. We can discuss it later. About if they're incapacitated and they don't have family, what are we allowed to do for them, right? We can talk about that, but I want to keep focused on the fact that in the event that it is a complex decision, we do our best with the individual to get them to understand it to the greatest of their capacity to understand. So it's somewhat, well, I wouldn't say it's easier, but it's somewhat more straightforward to talk to someone from the healthcare background or a bio background about getting your appendix out and the risk of infection and all that stuff, right? Doctors make the worst patients, we know that. But it's harder to have someone who doesn't have that level of education to get them informed to a place where you feel comfortable with their capacity to make that decision. Okay, so what I'd like you to guide us along, is with that in mind, that the downstream of their decision is not limited to the individual. It then in this scenario, in a public health scenario, in a pandemic, you can provide information and education to the maximum of their capacity, and that is individualized. But downstream from that, it isn't that individual who's solely affected. So with that kind of context, and then I'll pause you in a few minutes with my other stuff, but go ahead, keep going. Sorry to bother. Go ahead.
That's right. So this is the shift point. And as I was suggesting, actually, I'm grateful that Sanjay breaks in right there, because this is the point where, as I was suggesting, this is really the limit of the standard way of thinking about medical people engaging with patients or potential patients about their medical decisions. Now, the choice to wash one's hands, wear a mask, socially isolate to a certain degree under certain circumstances, these are all medical choices that are personal to the individual. So it's not that they have no impact on the health of the individual. In fact, in many cases, they may have serious impacts. Take a brief example from someone we've met in our practice recently, unable to go to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings recently because they have been closed to in-person work due to COVID. Didn't have a virtual option really available to them. Fell back into a terrible relapse of drinking, felt alone in the world, got to the verge of a suicidal crush and ended up in our hospital, right? So this is someone who didn't have much of a choice when it came to the AA meeting situation, but also because the AA meetings were closed, didn't feel like it would be acceptable or okay for him to reach out to his sponsor and get together face-to-face, hand-to-hand, and share that experience of what they do to help each other in their walk towards sobriety. He felt like he wasn't permitted to get what he needed, right? And so it is a personal choice for that individual I've described to follow the rules that we have imposed from the outside. It has personal health implications for him. So this is not a black or white. This isn't, I've been talking up to this point about people making decisions about their own health, and now the COVID question is basically really only relevant to what does it mean for somebody else? Absolutely not true. It is not either or, it's both and. But the fact that it is and as opposed to just you is a real challenge for medicine, and it's a particular challenge for medicine in America, where in medicine in America, as I highlighted on the previous slides, we really are serious about autonomy. That's why we have so much structure around these ideas and thinking about an analysis, because we are serious about individualism and autonomy in the United States, arguably more than just about any other nation in America. And so our principles that we use to guide medical ethics really place autonomy first among equals. It's an interesting concept you may have heard from other arguments. There are other principles that guide good medical ethical care, but autonomy really carries the day if there's a debate in most cases in the United States. It isn't the only way to operate, but it tends to be the way that we operate. So because of that, this situation where we have folks who really are being asked to make a decision that isn't about them themselves, put that up against questions of autonomy, and you've got some serious trouble on your hands to try to navigate some of the conflict. So that's really the limit of where medicine can go up to this point. So now I'm going to shift out of medicine proper to talk about some other things that I don't think we spend a lot of time really discussing in medicine. I think it would help us within medicine to import some of these concepts, which is the reason why I actually had some of these slides already ready for other reasons. But I also think they apply to the pandemic. And hopefully there'll be sort of echoes of those concepts that you'll be able to apply to what we're talking about as we go through these others. So let's shift over. Let's get out of the world of medicine. Don't think medicine automatically. Just think about human type peoples making decisions on a day-to-day basis. I want vanilla ice cream. Nope, I want chocolate. I am or I am not going to get in the car today, and I'm going to go to the park and I'm going to walk around with the dog. I'm going to play tennis. Am I going to do it? Am I not going to do it? We actually have a fair bit of information from the realm of psychology and neuroscience that tells us what parts of our brains help us to make decisions and how we make them. And it is true that there are some aspects of the work of trying to make a choice about something that do really involve sort of looking at it, right? Explicit knowledge of the situation and likely outcomes. If I eat vanilla ice cream, it's going to taste like good vanilla to me. If I eat too much of it, I'm going to get even fatter. Basic stuff, right? So there's a knowledge of outcomes about how this is going to go. So we spend some time thinking about that when we make choices. But what we know from a lot of really good sophisticated neuropsychological data and experimentation is that there are some subtle and sometimes not clearly overt, not clearly sort of nameable or easily understood processes that go into people making choices that aren't about weighing objective evidence. So already we're making a shift here. Remember, I told you before, medicine relies on those four concepts that sound very sort of, nuts and boltsy, and like this is how you think about stuff and you measure risks and benefits and such. But normal human beings making choices across all different realms of their lives, and it includes medicine, but all sorts of different areas, don't actually make choices based on cognating alone or weighing things alone or having a declarative knowledge about the situation alone. There are other things going on. So if I claim that that's true, you probably want to know what those other things might be, right? Well, one of the ways to try to figure it out is actually to study really carefully people who don't have that ability, who have demonstrated that they've got a problem. And some of you may know who Antonio Damasio is. He's a really neat guy in the field of neuroscience and neuropsychology. He was fascinated with the case, this legendary story of a man who was working on a railroad and it was tamping down some dynamite and unfortunately set the powder off, and the rod that he was using to tamp it down was blasted straight up under his, well, not under his chin, but actually went through his cheek and through a portion of his brain and out the top of his head, shot it straight through, clean through and through. And afterwards, it was actually remarkable, the recovery he made. He got through on the surface without having any major deficits. But over time, this man, his name is Phineas Gage, showed himself to have some other deficits that were more subtle. He was not making good choices with his life. He developed relational difficulties at work. He really treated his wife very poorly, started to get in fights for no apparent reason when before he was a very affable guy. And so he was making choices in a way that didn't really fit. But it was remarkable how nothing else seemed to be wrong. He could balance a checkbook. He could make change. He could walk, talk, do the work at his previous job. He went back to work, right? So he could do all these things, which means his neurologic system seemed to be intact, but there was something wrong. And so it turns out that there are parts of the brain that don't have an obvious function on the surface that actually play a really key role in how people make decisions. And so based on the story of Gage And actually, literally, like he was thinking about the picture of this man's skull, which was saved for posterity in medical science, and thinking about the injury and where it must have damaged his brain, and then thinking about more advanced concepts in neuroscience. Damasio hypothesized that there were parts of our brain that aren't directly related to a lot of the measurable things we ask people to do. Can you repeat the months of the year? Can you do some subtraction? Can you move your finger when I ask you to? All these things. Not those measurable things, but stuff that's less obvious, buried in structures deeper in the brain that are wired more directly to the rest of our bodies. And so he hypothesized that those areas of the brain might have something to do with how we make choices. And he named it the somatic marker hypothesis, because he was pretty sure that even if we couldn't put our finger on what it was that people were thinking about or not thinking about when they made choices, they were likely using these parts of the brain to make choices in a way that we would figure out registered some other way. How other way would you say? Well, he came up with some physiologic tests to try to measure how this would go. And he added this extra layer of sort of an interesting tweak to his hypothesis, that when people don't have ironclad information, like, I know that if I eat this, I'm going to have this outcome. I know that if I go and play tennis, I'm going to have this outcome. Why do I know this? Because I've been down that road before. I've done vanilla ice cream before. I've played tennis before. When people don't have a framework of some reasonable level of certainty based on experience or reliable information, now you can associate back to medical things again, like a situation where we have reasonable data and outcomes, and we feel pretty certain about what will happen if we do X, Y, or Z, because we can see the consequence of our action pretty soon afterwards, so we get that feedback. When that is lacking, Damasio claimed that these other areas of the brain were actually much more critical to how people made decisions. Right? So that previous slide, it's possible that there is a major component that does involve some explicit knowledge of outcomes and thinking about utility and stuff. But what if you don't have a good guess about how things are going to go? It's uncertain. You don't really know how it's going to go for you. If you don't know, Damasio suggested, I think these other areas of the brain, not the part of the brain that we use to overtly say what our wishes are or calculate things or other things like that, but those unconscious processes driven by these other parts of the brain probably rule the day in our decision making. That was his guess. And then he tested it, did some experiments to test it. And it turns out that he was right on the money in some really interesting ways. So a couple of areas of the brain that are worth knowing about. This is maybe not the neuroscience you were looking for on a Tuesday evening, but here you have it. There are some structures of the brain that are really essential, even though they're tiny. They're really essential to how we make really big decisions. It's kind of scary in a way. Our head's this big. We have all this matter that we've got on the outer, sort of the helmet area of the way that the brain is put together that we do rely on for all these things that we can measure. But it's these smaller, deeper structures that seem to rule the day when there's serious stuff going on. What kind of serious stuff? Serious meaning like, if I do this, I'm going to get a reward. Things are going to go really, really well for me. I'm going to win. Or I'm going to get hurt if I do it this way. If there's some sort of a sense that there's a reward attached to doing it a particular way or a punishment coming your way, the amygdala is playing a major role in that. Amygdala means almond, actually, in Italian and Latin, which is kind of neat because it looks like an almond and it's really only about that big. So just thinking about how small this is, it's actually smaller than an almond compared to the rest of the brain. It's remarkable how much of a role it plays. And so you can read some of this stuff I've got on the slides to see what the neuropsychological importance of the structure is. The other thing that's kind of cool here is that because these structures are buried deep in the brain where their connections are closer to the rest of our body, there's literally neuroscientific evidence for the concept of going with your gut. We talk about gut feelings a lot, right? Oh, I don't know. Like, I just have a sense. My gut tells me that this is the right thing to do. It's literally true. You never would have thought it. We thought that this was just a metaphor because this is the way that we talk. It's amazing that we actually came up with this way of describing how we make certain choices, or how we attempt to describe why and how we made a choice that we did, without really having a calculation that we can say, here's how I calculated this. I did this risk benefit analysis. This is how I chose it. We know we didn't do it that way. We know it comes from somewhere. We feel a sense of certainty, and it's bodily. It actually is bodily. There's literally a connection between these areas of the brain and the rest of the body, where there's a two-way flow of traffic between what we take in for information, how it makes us feel in our body, what those feelings in our body do to us in terms of how they motivate us. The traffic goes back north to tell the brain, it would probably feel better if we went this route. And that has a lot to do with how we make our choices. It's kind of a scary feeling when you think about it, when we've evolved this monster brain compared to other species on the planet. And yet still in many, many situations, particularly those that involve uncertainty, rewards, punishments, big issues, we are ruled by tiny parts of our brains that we actually share with other animals that we think we are much more advanced than. Powerful thing to try to sort of have to get your mind around, no pun intended.
JJ, just out of my own curiosity, is it vagal nerve or beyond the vagal nerve?
Vagal plus others too, we think, because there are also some inputs into the spinal cord in the sympathetic ganglia that line the side of the spinal cord that get inputs from more than just the vagus itself. So yes, the vagus, but also additional ones as well.
Okay.
And this is part of the reason why it matters what neurotransmitter activity is going on, not just in your central nervous system, but even in the rest of your body, and how they affect how you make decisions, how you feel. Truly, how you feel is how you feel, not just how you feel.
Okay.
I have a question, and maybe you're getting to this.
Okay.
This is Karen. So when you say damage, I hone in on that word. So not just physical damage, but emotional trauma. Has that been explored?
Karen, you're like a plant. I could kiss you. We are going there. You are exactly right. That certainly the Phineas Gage type injuries where a railroad spike goes through your head are dramatic, and they register as damage that we could all see, on a glowing image of a brain. The hole in the skull is obvious. But you are absolutely right that the other kinds of things that affect us, that shape us, that help us grow, that support us, but also that damage us, hurt us, stress us, they affect these areas deeply and profoundly. And that's really one of the major punchlines of what I'm talking about, is that having those areas of the brain shaped by experience has a lot to do with how we make our choices. And then that is really going to define both the opportunities as well as the limits that we have to try to engage people who have had those kinds of experiences in their lives to do what would be helpful for them and for other people. You're right on the money. That's actually what we're doing. Thank you very much.
And then I imagine you're going to get to this too, that during certain periods of our life, our brain is in different stages of development. So if something happens to you while you're a teenager or younger, it might be different reaction than when you were an adult.
Yeah, and it matters more the earlier and more often something occurs in terms of laying down the memories that matter to these things, because our memories and our experiences are laid down in these areas, again, seemingly really, really tiny in the grand scheme of all the brain tissue that we've got. But that's exactly where those things register the most powerfully. And then they come home to roost later when we have to make choices as adults. You got it. That's right. So the insular cortex is another one of those little areas where, for a long time in neuroscience, we really didn't have much of an idea about what it did at all. But we have a couple of advanced techniques, one of them being called functional MRI, which is basically a technique that puts people in an MRI scanner, uses a high-powered magnet in order to flip water molecules within the neurons and other cells of our brain, and then allow them to flip back and see where they are in terms of structure. There's also a way to add on to that structure a functional analysis of how much oxygen is being recruited to different areas of the brain when the brain does different tasks, right? Because you need oxygen in order to burn fuel and do the work that is required of you in different areas of the brain light up on these scans when they're being used depending on what the task is. Well, it turns out when you give people a choice to make, that involves telling them specifically about aspects of the situation that may or may not be fair to them, the insular cortex lights up like a Christmas tree. The insular cortex is very important for appraising whether or not it seems like we're being dealt with fairly. And that is really, really important, because that same area of the brain is also the part that is most closely hardwired to those gut feeling experiences, those feelings that we have in our body that go north to tell our brain, hey, there's something you need to think about here and take very seriously when it comes to what choice you make. So I'll take you back to medical decision making real quick. The example here that is commonly discussed is, what if there are two people in the same room in a hospital? They've both got the same cancer. They're both being talked to by their respective oncologists about what to be done about the situation. HIPAA being respected, unfortunately, this is a shared room with only a curtain between, and one of the patients gets to overhear the conversation of the other one. And depending on the snippets that are heard or the reality of what's communicated, if patient A thinks that patient B is being offered a better deal, patient A then, when given options between what to choose, is greatly affected in the choice based on the biggest question in patient A's mind, which tends to dominate the dialogue, which is, how does this compare to what that guy's getting for options? Like, I've heard what you've told me about, and I've heard I could do this or that, but I don't know, am I getting the same deal as the other guy? And that sense, and whether or not they're being dealt with fairly, actually has a great deal to do, a great deal of power in determining what kind of choice that patient makes. And there's evidence that suggests that sometimes people make choices outside of what would really likely be their best interest, because they are more wrapped up in the sense of what is fair to them than they are about what would actually be useful to them as an individual. They're more wrapped up in the sense of what's going on with the other guy. So I'm sure you can take that and associate to thoughts about pandemics and how people are making choices for themselves and other people, when the focus is whether or not it's fair to me and about the other guy. So you can see how these brain regions are really important when it comes to the kinds of questions that we're trying to deal with a pandemic. I just wanted to show you a picture of the brain, just to give you a sense that we're talking about these tiny little areas buried deep within the brain, in this area here too, inside, not all this real estate out here on the outside that has a lot to do with all the measurable stuff that neurologists can test for on physical exams, and things that go dramatically wrong that when people have a stroke. These are actually areas of the brain that are really highly preserved. They have really good blood flow. They're hard to harm in an anatomic way because they're so deep. Brain damage, that's physical. It's hard to hurt these regions. So they're really well protected. They're very precious. They're precious evolutionarily. But as Karen was alluding to before, it doesn't mean that they aren't impacted by our life experiences. So they may not be as often impacted by a stroke or impacted by a head injury in a car wreck or playing football, but they absolutely are impacted.
So JJ, this is a corollary question. Are these emotional wounds as important as perhaps, physical inactivating primitive responses within the brain? I mean, do we have any study on whether or not, these physical versus emotional wounds is there an equal impact on these parts of the brain?
We don't have really good studies, Sanjay, because to be able to compare them head to head would be extremely challenging. To try to match patients and know that you knew what differences between one group and another were actually attributable to the differences in the injuries. But we do actually know that it's remarkable how adaptable human brains are, especially when they're young. If they sustain a single physical insult, that then there is an ability or an attempt at healing, a combination of medical intervention to make sure that, for instance, blood flow is restored as best as it can be, or at least offending growth of other tissues is removed so that the brain has a chance to adapt. If there's a single insult, actually the brain is remarkably resilient at being able to work around that kind of a problem, unless the damage is so targeted and profound like it was in Gage's case. That was really terrible. But, you know, singleton injuries that might seem really dramatic. It's like, oh gosh, you interrupted the blood flow to that tissue. Some of those neurons died. That's awful. But that is actually probably, we're not 100% sure, but all else being equal, that is not likely to be as problematic as it would be instead to endure week after week, after month, after year of traumatic experiences and neglect from early life during the development of a brain. We're much more likely to be able to adapt if we have a secure foundation of development in place. We sustain one injury, and then we're asked to try to figure out how to adapt. That person has a much better prognosis than the person who has all of the repeated injury that isn't physical in nature.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. So one other thing about sort of looping back around to medical decisions, but I'm going to have you do that work in the background while I tell you about a really neat, one more interesting experiment that Damasio did, that crafted with both with studying some known brain injured patients, but first and foremost doing this with normal people. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this. I'm sorry if I bore you if you already know about what this thing is, but I have to outline what it is for you to understand the punchline, because I think it's just so cool. So the Iowa gambling experiment, it's very simple. It involves a situation where the subject of the experiment is given a pot of money to play with. And they're given, the individual's given 2 decks of cards, one red deck and one blue deck. And it's very simple. They're told there are cards within these decks that are winners. We're going to shuffle up both decks. We're going to set them both in front of you, red deck, blue deck. You must, every time we go through one of the passes of this test, you must wager some money. You have to put some of the money you've got out on the table to wager. If you turn over a win card, we will double your money. We'll give you back whatever it is that you just put down. Doubled. If you lose, if it's not a winner card, we take it away. That's all. You get to pick. You turn over whatever card you want, one card every time, wager money. Okay? So that's very simple setup, right? So here's the thing that the subject does not know. The red deck has considerably fewer winner cards in it than the blue deck, right? So nothing is said about that at the start. So one might think, well, they're probably equal because nothing was said about it. But the reality is that they're not. There are a lot more winners in the blue deck than the red deck. Okay, so that's the background of the experiment, but you're not told about it. You're just told, turn over cards, bet money, see how it goes. So you can see how this is going to go, right? People are going to turn over cards, and they're going to bet money, and they're going to win in certain cases, they're going to lose in certain cases. And in theory, their experience of, remember what we said before, reward and punishment, is going to help to guide their decisions going forward. It's going to alter their behavior, right? That's what a normal human being would probably do, you would think. Absolutely true. The really cool thing is in the details of how that works. So if you take normal people and you wire them up for this process, so you have a monitor for how they're breathing, how fast, how deeply, you watch their heart rate, you put on electrodes to see how much their skin is conducting as a function of how much they're sweating. So you wire them up for this process, right? And then you start the test. Here you go. Here's your money. You go at it. Just start turning over the cards. And all you do is watch people go through this. It's a really cool thing that happens. It doesn't take very long. Only about 10 cards into the process on average that something happens in the physical activity response to the red decks. Red decks, right? The ones I told you have fewer winners in it. Remember that emphasis we had before on people making decisions based on a sense of fairness? So there's something in the physiology of the experience of sitting and doing this task that registers incredibly quickly. Just 10 cards in, the person's body says, something's fishy here, something's up, something's up. You can measure it physiologically, even though at that point, at 10 cards in, the 11th card, there's no pattern of what people do with the 11th card in terms of whether or not I'm just making it simple, the 11th card. But let's say the average defines everybody. If by 10 cards in, your body is telling you something, your 11th card is not turned or bet on any differently than the 10th one. So there's a gut reaction. There's something going on, but the person hasn't changed behavior. How long does it take to change behavior? Well, it turns out that it takes a lot more cards for people to actually get their quote unquote act together and figure out what to do with the gut information. Their guts are already, though, giving them lots and lots of information about the situation they're in. So just think about real life situations, medical decisions, sure. Choices about what to do to take care of other people in their medical lives, or vanilla versus chocolate, or whatever it is. If your body is all this time between 10 cards and 50 cards, expand that out to a decision-making situation, all this time where your body's constantly bombarding you with messages. There's something up here, there's something up here. You have been framed into a feeling about the situation pretty robustly before anyone can see what your decision is going to be. And look at this kicker. You start making choices that are different. You start betting more money on the blue deck, and you start turning cards over from the blue deck more often because you're allowed to, because you know on some level, I'm more likely to win with the blue deck. But if you ask people around the 40 to 50 to 60 card range, hey, what are you doing there? I noticed something. There seem to be more cards off the blue deck. There's a bigger pile next to that one than the red one. What are you doing? What is a normal human being? Normal, not a brain damaged person, normal human being. What do they say? Oh, seriously. They have no clue. They are acting in their interest based on the game that you have set up for them. Their body's been telling them to do it. They figured it out, but they don't know why. They can't put it into words. They can't explain it. They can only explain it to you finally after 30 more cards after their behavior changes. I think this is wild stuff. I think this matters a great deal to all sorts of decisions that we make. This is the reason, again, why I said I had these slides ready to try to apply some of these ideas to the question of COVID and how we make our choices. But I talk about this in relation to medical decisions and how people make their choices about their own medical health and what we're offering for choices and how they feel about it. I talk to other practitioners I consult to all the time that you want them to make a rational decision and explain to them how and why they did it. A la the capacity rubric that I gave you before.
Yes.
They made their decision well ahead of that. And their body was telling them how and why they ought to be making that decision, or that something's up about the situation that leans them in a particular direction miles before you ever ask them explicit questions about why they're choosing what they're choosing. So if you ever wondered why it is that debates on the internet and other places where people are sharing information and begging people, come on, man, give me the logic of why you're going at this way. That ship has sailed. If you think that that's the way in which you're going to get somebody to come along with you, or you're going to, quote, win an argument, forget it. They were getting messages from a different source that isn't you well ahead of that. And they started making their decision for what they were doing well before they could ever tell you why. The train left the station. It's extreme to put it back in, right?
Yes. So this is a perfect, another pivot point, not pivot point, a pause point to address some questions. So that's really eye-opening. That's very eye-opening, because I have a set of my own questions here to kind of give us a framework as we enter the question and answer phase. I know there are people in the attendee list that are chomping at the bit to ask you questions, but I want you to address David Thomas's question here, because I think it's apropos at this point, which is that Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett has stated in her research with neuroscience that we are not at the mercy of our emotions, that the brain creates them, and that to an extent they are learned responses. He says, I'm loath to accept that people who refuse masking, refuse to quarantine, or refuse specific treatment lack the ability to eventually come to evidence-based answers. If emotional trauma has similar impact to physical trauma on decision-making, when can we say that we're talking about capacity versus rationalization? It's, it seems like you said, well, I don't want to put thoughts in your mind or words in your mouth. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Wait, I have a question though. When he says capacity, what does he mean by that? Does he mean basically IQ or?
Well, I imagine he means, based on the concepts that I had laid out before, just in some basic way, have the ability to understand the situation and think about it in a way that actually takes the data, doesn't just act or just feel and do, but
He
actually
says
take the information and utilize it as part of a choice process.
ability to be informed is what he wants to clarify.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, have the capacity to be informed, right? Yeah. Well, so I'm not trying to be overly pessimistic or narrowly sort of stuck in our dialogue about what we would do, but I am implying, David, that non-cognitive processes have such a powerful impact that it is very difficult to work through those same channels to try to get to an endpoint that we would like to get to. It doesn't mean that folks might not reach an endpoint that is perhaps more of what you would like them to reach, or more adaptable or more helpful, that might make more quote unquote rational sense. It doesn't mean they can't get there. But the suggestion here is that the way to get there might be different from what we would think it would be. If folks struggle to make use of information, or if, more importantly, they have already taken in a certain amount of information and now their whole selves have led them in a particular direction, the inertia of that process can be very, very difficult to work against head on, rather than thinking about the direction that someone is already going, try to understand how they're going that way, and then maybe jump on with them in the direction that they're going, so that you might be able to take the wheel together and move in a different direction. That might make some more sense. But it took a lot of these folks a long time to get into that spot, right? When Karen mentioned before that she sort of was anticipating where some of this discussion is going, thinking about people who have been hurt early and often in repeated ways. It took a long time to create that trouble. So it isn't reasonable to expect that you'll get out of it quickly. It's likely to take a fair bit of work to get to the backside of the situation too. So let me just advance a slide, because I think it's worth looking at it this way. If you look at patients who have true damage, like have had a weird stroke or a traumatic injury to these key areas that I mentioned before, you put them in this same task and they actually show deficits. So I think it's cool that people make decisions in non-cognitive, non-conscious ways, even though we might like to say, boy, it'd be really nice if they would just use rationality. But the we and the they there is a false dichotomy. We are they. We all, if we view ourselves as normal in the sense that we haven't had these horrible brain injuries, we make decisions the same way mostly. So we might want to be able to say, no, but I make my decision because it's more rational to fill in the blank, wear a mask, social distance, whatever it is that we're arguing for. We'd like to say we do it because it's more rational. But actually, Damasio's research would suggest that that is not true. Even though we have a rational explanation for why we do it, the why we do it for folks who make a choice that appears to be rational is in some ways the same why, in most ways the same why, for people who make what looks like a not rational decision. That's really what's so incredibly compelling about this. So although it might disturb you, David, it disturbs me too. We want to say, but look at the evidence. But look, oh, come on, you have to be able to see this. The really scary answer is that actually, if you and I are in the same camp on some of these behavior issues, and we probably are related to the pandemic, you and I aren't any more really rational when we make our choice. Even though we think we are, we're not. And it's only people who have other kinds of impairments that help to shine a light on that, to really show us, oh my gosh, we're actually more alike people who make choices that we don't agree with than we are not like them. And that bonding, that communal sameness that we have, that we share with other people, I think is actually the starting point to getting ourselves to a better place with this. Recognizing sameness, not difference. Because when you've got real difference, then you've got serious impairments. Look at this stuff. Like when you've had your VMPFC knocked out, like Phineas Gage, Those people are totally insensitive to the negative consequences of their choices. What does that mean in the context of the Iowa gambling experiment? They start plopping down huge amounts of money, and they don't, red, blue, red, they don't care. They don't, and they're losing money hand over fist with the red deck. Doesn't change their behavior one bit. They missed the boat. So even though the data are in front of them that say, but buddy, you keep betting red, you keep losing. Come on, man, bet blue. It will not stick. Even if you teach it to them, it won't stick, because they have a part of their brain that is truly missing when it comes to having it matter that they're losing. They don't care that they're losing. So that's a very different set of impairments, right? And look at the amygdala. If you are really, like, if you're missing a functional amygdala, you can't get an emotional signal. These people don't have skin conductance changes. They don't have a change in their heart rate and breathing when they start losing money. They don't feel it. They truly don't feel it in a real way. And you can't integrate and what if you have those two things intact, but your insula is shot? Well, unfortunately, your body starts kicking out messages. Your skin conductance changes, your heart rate goes up, your breathing gets deeper, but those things don't impact your brain. They don't change your behavior. So you've got all those weird physiologic things going on. And if you're asked, like, how do you feel? You're like, I'm kind of uncomfortable here. But that human being does not draw more blue cards than red. They're uncomfortable with what's going on. They're experiencing a problem, but they can't register the feeling in a way that they can do something about it. So these are really profound deficits. They really matter. When people are really, like, when they've got serious damage and they've been knocked out and they haven't adapted to it yet, these folks really can't do it. Well, think about that stuff. Now I'll go back to what Karen told us. Let's think about serious impact, not impact from I had a stroke in the wrong place or a really bad brain injury. But let's extrapolate this to early life experience and relationships. What else does the insula do besides what Damasio showed us? The insula, either fortunately or unfortunately, is one of those key places that registers the emotional experience and the risk assessment that goes along with what it's like to interact with somebody else. So how does it feel for me to talk to, or if I disagree with them, fight with Sanjay about something on the internet? Whoa, we talked about that stuff last week, right? Like, holy cow, pretty scary, feels risky. He's gonna bite my head off and I'm gonna lose. So people who have a functioning insula are ready to make that kind of appraisal about what it feels like to be in a battle of wits with him and what they're risking if they end up taking a chance on trying to fight with him. People who have had really difficult life experiences over and over and over again, where they have had bad emotional interpersonal reactions and they have risked a lot and lost. Those people are wired truly in a different way when it comes to dealing with new information. And so they may not look quite like Damasio's patients, where in the wake of one of those brain injuries, before they've had chances to adapt, but right after it's happened, they have like no insular function. They're not that bad, but they are clearly not the kind of rational agent that Thomas Jefferson hoped would be casting votes in our country, that Descartes thought defined what it meant to be a human being because they thought, and that defined their existence. That stuff isn't true. The mind-body split is a false dichotomy, and Damasio collapses it in these incredible ways. What about the amygdala? The amygdala helps us to understand when we should be fearful and when we should kick in our survival instincts. So what if you're constantly being subjected to potentially life-threatening things? And as Karen was implying, what if it happens really early on in life? So even if it really isn't truly life-threatening, but because you're so little and so relatively powerless, it may feel like you're constantly in fear. What might that do then? Dial up to 2020 and you're a 42-year-old adult and someone approaches you and says, guess what? There's this unseen thing floating around in the air. You have no idea about where it is at any given time. You can't control it. It might get you. You don't have a really high risk of dying from it, but you have a few extra pounds and you've got high blood pressure. Your blood sugar is not so great. So if it's going to get somebody, it's going to get you, buddy. How are you going to react? It's hard to know sometimes about what you're going to get for a response. So this is the problem. This is why I could, like, kiss Karen for being the plant in the audience, because this is really what we need to deal with. We need to deal with actually not just one or two people, not just that guy or that person in your family who you really care about who has been hurt. We need to deal with a society full of a significant portion of people who have had at least enough things happen in their lives that make their amygdala, their insula, and their VMPFC do things that don't allow what Dave would like to allow. And that is a synergy between the emotional experience of responding to a crisis or a threat and cognitive rationality, and have them partner together so that there's harmony and our choices flow with what is required. That risk of having them not fit together is actually much more common than you might think it is. I'm not telling you that this means that literally everybody is mentally ill in one particular way if they tell you, I will or will not do this related to the pandemic. The thing is, there's a lot of variability out there in what our brains are able to do for us and whether or not we can rely on them. And they have been affected deeply by what has happened to us before we ever got to this point in time. And so that's why I say it this way, that there are, in some ways, unfortunately, very susceptible biasing inputs here. If we have had previous difficulties in interpersonal issues, like when people have given us choices or told us what to do or tried to guide us or help us or protect us, and we have had fraught relationships there, we're not in a good spot to be able to work with authority figures during a time of crisis, because after all, we've been in crises before. It hasn't gone very well. And so why would we expect it to go well now if we decide to go along with what the authority figure tells us in our lives? That authority figure could be Tony Fauci. That authority figure could be Donald Trump. That authority figure could be your doctor. It could be the triage nurse at your emergency room when you show up for care. Somebody in a position to either help or hurt you, tell you what to do, guide you. Some folks are not really wired to do well with those care relationships because of established previous difficulties in those relationships. And then the other big factor, unfortunately, that renders human brains, relatively vulnerable is that what has happened to us recently has a lot to do sometimes with what we do next. We have those biases in medicine all the time. If the last 3 people you saw with a certain presentation seem to have a certain outcome, and you think it's because you intervened in a particular way, the next time you see another patient looking the same way, you're likely to do it that way the 4th time around. But what if the bigger picture is actually what you're doing has nothing to do with the evidence base, but recent cases have gone really, really well, and you feel really good about yourself as a doctor? You could make terrible blunders by recommending the same thing over and over and over again because you think what you recommended was the thing that made things go well. And then you believe that that is the evidence that should drive your decisions going forward.
I have no idea what you're talking about right now.
Well, this is the reason why, although it drives me crazy when I hear people who have MD and DO after their name have the nerve to do things like push hydroxychloroquine, it's because I also have sensitivity to them. Yeah. Because if they think they have seen people take hydroxychloroquine and get better, and then because their emotional state is so hung on the idea that they want to feel like they've done something to help somebody, they want to attribute what they recommended to the outcome. Those recent experiences then drive practice and recommendations and the way they vocalize and things like that. So even though it drives me nuts, again, back to Dave, the cognitive aspect of it, it makes no bloody sense.
Yes.
Science
excuse me, I'm sorry, but I heard a forbidden word, and we'll be adding 1 demerit to your scorecard here. Please carry on.
Thank you. So JJ, I think we've hit a flow. I think you've really synthesized all of this evidence and science beautifully.
Well, I wanted to say that it's not just about us as patients or just members of the human species in public health. Medical people are susceptible. So normal people make decisions this way, in this irrational way, not irrational, but irrational.
Yes.
Meaning they don't cognate, they react and they act, and it's based on patterns that are ingrained. Patterns are ingrained for doctors too. So we're all actually vulnerable to all this. And so we're all in this together. And I do have a level of compassion, even for people who make really seemingly stupid statements, because it's got to come from somewhere. And so trying to understand where they're coming from, I think, is what I'm advocating for, even at this stage of the talk before we finish. You can see that's where I'm already headed, is trying to have some compassion and a desire to understand rather than trying to fight it.
So there's two questions that would be perfect to interject now. One is on the individual level from Deborah. I hope I pronounce her name correctly, Perrin. Can people train themselves as a result of becoming aware of these, these innate patterns and susceptibilities? Can they train themselves to make decisions more rationally versus irrationally, as you put it? And then that let's leave that as an overarching umbrella, because in the event that you have a society that is not making decisions that are beneficial for themselves at the individual level or collectively. David Thomas has another excellent question about, in a court case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905, the result gave great leeway to states in enacting their police powers to create policies that protect general welfare of the public, even when it infringes upon individual liberty. Right. This limited the rights of citizens even under the 14th Amendment when their behaviors place significant burden on others. It's been used mostly for vaccine mandates for schools, but also most recently in New York to fine individuals who were unimmunized and refused to self-quarantine. And on the negative side, it's been used to justify things like sterilization, random drug testing, in 2020, even limiting abortion access. So I don't know how they got to that. But to what degree are medical professionals consulted upon ethical limits about public health policies in the context of the choices that negatively impact the public? Given that constitutionality of states using the police powers to protect the general welfare of the public, how do we limit excessive violation of self-agency while also protecting society and people collectively?
Very nice. Good stuff. So let's go backwards in time, since that is such a complex and really rich comment with a question built into it.
Yeah.
That one sticks in my head better. I'll do that one first and then go back to the previous one. Okay. This is marvelous, and I really appreciate you bringing up the legal precedent that helps to support some of the things that have occurred in the past. The one that you didn't highlight, which is the one I would say is probably the most relevant to the current situation, is that the same precedent and the same rationale defines why we have the concept of reportable diseases.
Yes.
There are certain infectious diseases which, if you contract them, we do actually have the power. Physicians are supported by the power of the state to insist that people submit to treatment for them so that they don't harm other people by spreading it. And so also to identify that they are case carriers so that their contacts or potential contacts can be informed, warned, etc., so that other people are not harmed. So the reason why I bring that one up is because there is a precedent here. And I am a little bit surprised that I haven't seen in the public discourse much of a push to try to use that logic and that precedent to try to do something more about getting people to partner up and help with the situation. Now, of course, it does not solve the problem of, I don't know if I'm currently a carrier. You don't know. Yeah. You haven't been tested. The test isn't available. I'm not sick with the illness. I don't know. But if you are a known infected and or ill person, that in theory, based on precedent, should change the game for that particular individual and his behavior or choice. But we haven't decided, at least in any jurisdiction that I'm aware of, to then go that extra step and say, not only would we like to call you afterwards and contact trace, and please, pretty please, with sugar on top, quarantine yourself and don't do that, but actually we're going to make it so because with other diseases we have in the past made it so. So we've chosen not to. But what I would say, David, is I think that it is time for the legal powers to do exactly what you're saying. Is you've asked, are medical professionals consulted? They absolutely have been consulted at every turn to make decisions about specific diseases. Because, like, for instance, in the state that I live in Minnesota, it's a journalistic place with a very, very long list of reportable diseases, not just one or two, but actually a lot of them. And they've relied heavily on infectious disease experts, many of them from Mayo Clinic. We have the privilege of having that institution within this state. And so they have asked those folks to work with legislators to try to make decisions about what diseases do or do not go on the list, and then what is required and what are the punishments, and what are the powers of the state available to do something about folks who violate the requirements in a way that puts other people at risk. So you're absolutely right that overreach here is really costly and really problematic and dangerous and troublesome. And we're also living in a time where we're contending with issues of really profound systemic racism in medicine and in society. And so we have to really be sensitive about what we might impose for a policy and how that might differentially affect different members of our society based on everything from their socioeconomic status to their access to healthcare, to the reality of what it would mean to force individual A to put his life on hold and get treatment versus putting patient B's life on hold and forcing her to get treatment. And what does that mean about the status of their families and things? So these are not easy questions, but I will say I am surprised that we haven't decided to try to do something and partner together with the executive branch of government, with lawmakers and medical professionals to try to come up with some sort of reasonable approach here. It may be a top-down influence problem. I'm not really sure, but I'm actually surprised. The last part I'd say is that maybe it's the uncertainty. Maybe going back to the beginning of where I started with this about what makes this situation different is we may not feel like we know the disease well enough at this stage to know for sure that if we were to legislate, that recommendation would be durable and adequate and fair and obtain over the course of time. Like if we made a decision now based on what we think we know about how this virus operates, and then we learn some other things that would make it to say, oh, shoot, we shouldn't require this of people, but we sure as heck should require this of people. How quickly will we be able to change the law to respond to the change in science? So because if you look at the history of these laws, they actually came in well after we had a really good handle on what tuberculosis was, because that's one of the reportable diseases. We really had a lot of science before we made the choice. So maybe that's what it is. Maybe there's a worry about doing something about it too quickly. Going back to the first question and kind of using it to segue back into the ending portion of my talk, it is possible for individuals who are incentivized to recognize that they have some limitations or some problems with their choices and the way they're conducting their lives, to engage in certain kinds of practices that do help to harness the power of the brain and the adaptive portions of it to make up for the parts that don't always serve individuals very well. In many cases, it still isn't allowing for cognating so much, but you're right that is a possibility. And it's interesting to think about it because in a way that's artificial, right? I was suggesting before that people who are normal, quote unquote, who seem to also make decisions that are in reasonable line with health and well-being for themselves and other people, they are as irrational as folks who make what look like irrational, horrible decisions. So then for that second group, you ask an interesting question. Are there techniques that would allow people to kind of dampen the impact of their disordered brain systems so that there's room for them to make a more rational decision? The answer is yes. And it's interesting that you ask it that way because you wouldn't think that would be the goal, would you? Like if I was saying normal people also operate irrationally, wouldn't you simply want to turn down the volume on those disordered brain systems so that they can act normally in a normal, irrational way? You might like that, but unfortunately, going back to what Karen said, it's very difficult to be able to do that. It's very difficult to be able to turn the volume down and then approximate quote unquote normal function, normal intrapsychic function, normal interpersonal function. And so you do end up actually with a result. When you get a good result, you get a result that fits with what you were asking. People are able to quiet those other processes and then do what's called top-down regulation. Top-down meaning they do cognate and they really think it through. They have to work hard, but they are able to then think and say, okay, so I know not to trust my automatic responses on this because I have abnormal traffic flow between my mind and my body, and the signals that I get have frequently misguided me in the past. I'm getting those kinds of feelings again. When I get those feelings, I know that what I need to do is I need to slow down, take stock, and think. And then what those people do is they actually end up shifting from unconscious, just going through the day kind of acting, and they do actually cognate on the situation. And that's how they make up for the suffering and damage they've had before that has made it harder for them to make good choices. The kinds of therapies that allow that to happen, mentalization-based therapy is probably the most powerful in this regard. It's a relatively new approach that is transdiagnostic in psychiatry, meaning it isn't designed to treat one particular kind of illness, but has actually been helpful for people managing all sorts of different kinds of conditions. Everything from post-traumatic stress to rip-roaring anxiety disorders to early life trauma that registers in a personality problem. And it even helps people with serious psychotic disorders as long as their symptoms are controlled well enough that they can take instruction and try the method. So mentalization can be quite helpful for that. Dialectical behavioral therapy also offers some benefit there. And that was originally designed for a particular illness, but it also, it turns out, is a set of skills that allows people to do exactly what you're asking about. Can I turn down the volume on this automatic reactivity? Amygdalar hyperfunction is particularly responsive to good DBT, and then people can, kind of turn down the glowing almond in there and say, can I use some other part of my brain to slow down? But then, as I'm suggesting, it's a coping, right? It's not a return to normalcy. It is a workaround. It's an adaptation. So that's
JJ, allow me. That's a beautiful explanation. Allow me to be cynical for a moment. First, by saying that I wish that everyone could avail of the mental health attention and therapy that they require to live healthier lives in this country. But we know that is in severe deficit among many other things that would be beneficial to our society as a whole. Mental health, these strategies, even the knowledge that these strategies exist and certain therapies exist for people to pursue is indescribably absent. With that in mind, we are dealing with a pandemic that has that is the consequences of which are very time sensitive. So going through on an individual basis or on a community basis with whatever modality that would be most effective to get people to make good decisions, rational decisions for themselves, it doesn't seem like it's a reasonable strategy to pursue. So, with that in mind, and there's another question, that I want to interject here because it's also important, is that emotional health of the individual isn't just about these choices that could lead to better physical health outcomes, but when it comes to risk versus risk in the era of a pandemic. But there's also, what is the benefit, the loss of benefit in closeness and emotional closeness, inability to date, if you're a single person, because I think a lot of that is what's driving traffic to the. I'm I'm being realistic without trying to be overly cynical here. It's what's driving a lot of traffic to the bars and to venues and to concerts and even to maybe even, churches and protests, that there are people that are looking for a emotional and physical connection to another human being. That closeness is being obviated in this. And then when you tell them, you can't go out, okay? They're now weighing the benefit versus the loss of the benefit of
And
not
it is
having.
personal for them, right? Right? It's personal. That's not just about the other. That's their own risk benefit calculus. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But okay, so you want to finish out, and then I'll put in the framework for the Q&A.
Sure. Yeah. No, I really appreciate those associations, Sanjay, because when you talk about the reality of how much need it appears is now out there, now that I've sort of outlined it this way, and you're thinking, gosh, like think about all the folks who probably need some true human support in order to get to an okay place during this incredibly stressful time with very difficult choices and competing interests. How in the world does everybody get what they need? You might chuckle at the same time that it would sort of, maybe it makes you more pessimistic to think about the reality of it. But I believe there's some truth in a rather simple statement, and that is, if everybody who needed a therapist had a therapist, everybody would be a therapist. There is so much need, and it takes true time spent with people to relate and connect and get to somewhere productive that you don't get there with meds. You don't get there with clicks. You don't get there with apps. You don't get there with sharing one-liner emoji electron-based kinds of communication. It really means you got to be together. You got to be together in a meaningful way. And it is possible to do it remotely, because I think we're having a remarkable interaction and connection here, even though we're not physically in the same room. So it can be done. The problem is, if we have a large percentage of people who don't even know what exactly it is that they're missing to start with, how to then replace it with something productive as a surrogate now is incredibly hard to do. So although, it feels a little pessimistic to say, well, if we had enough therapists for everybody, then everybody would literally be a trained therapist. But one of the upshots for this, for me, is that I think that we really, if we want to get somewhere, we need to offer ourselves in a truly meaningful way to other people. Although we have this world of so much information sharing constantly on the internet, and we have a world of, all these, I love this term for influencers, like people who literally are paid and they exist in order to influence lots of people. And I don't deny the power of it, but it is not a power that actually registers in a human embrace of the reality of the life we're trying to deal with. It nudges people, and yes, it's powerful to produce outcomes, but it is not the best way to actually reach people. And so I think that one of my messages here is going to be more about more people working with fewer people, but more intentionally and in a truly understood and connected way. And so, like, even though there's that funny insight about, if everybody who had a therapist, if everybody who needed a therapist had one, we would all be functioning as therapists. There are actually a couple of very humble but really sharp thinkers in the history of psychology who have noted that despite all the work that we do to categorize psychopathology and then come up with treatments for it, what we sometimes fail to realize is that a lot of people with significant mental distress, interpersonal problems, and other difficulties get better in a way that appears they get better on their own, without coming to a therapist, without taking medicines, without seeking professional help. And it looks like they get better on their own if you look for them. So that would be your first reaction, is to say, oh, they just get better on their own. Psychiatry and psychology they're full of it, right? They just want to get paid, and they just want to sell medicines. But what the really good studies in those realms do account for is the fact that those individuals who get better have people in their lives who serve an incredible therapeutic function. They're present, they listen, they understand, and they walk with. They don't drag people along, or they don't point them in another direction. They walk with them. And so that's what those really optimistic studies say about people who recover, who seem to have really terrible conditions. If you look at them diagnostically, when you meet them at some point in time, they look like they're terribly ill. But then we have really good literature, truly good longitudinal naturalistic literature that says that a lot of those people get better. And how do they get better? They get better because they meet an incredible spouse.
Yeah.
Where they get better because they find themselves in a job where they get a mentor who truly cares about them, truly mentors them. Yeah. Not somebody who's just their stinking boss who wears a nicer tie than they do. They really are with them. And so by extension, I'm hoping that that's something that we might be able to think about doing for each other as the first step before we start asking people to do stuff that's uncomfortable, before we start demanding of them, before we try to browbeat them with information and data and convince them. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to be with them. Because if we don't do that, I don't think we're going anywhere. And so that's, we might want to prize cognition. This COVID town hall that Sanjay's been putting on week after week after week for 20 plus in a row now, there's a lot of high level cognating going on here. This is really seriously sophisticated information, and it needs to be processed, and it needs to be used for good science to move forward. And then telling the public about it in this forum is really critical so that we keep up the dialogue between the experts who are trying to help us and the society we're trying to serve. But we can't expect that people are going to make choices based on cognating, because that's actually a secondary process and only artificially becomes the primary process when we work really hard to try to adapt. But you can't ask everybody to look in the mirror and say, is my personal psychology serving me properly in the time of COVID? I need to do some intentional thinking about this, and I need to do some slowing down before I make a choice about whether or not I'm going to put the mask on today, or whether or not I'm going to go to the bar tonight, or something like that. That's not how we operate. Context really, really matters. So just looping back right around one more time to some medical things to kind of tie this up in a bow, and then we'll do more associations and Q&A. There are some insights that we have from the world of medicine that tell us how things go. If you tell people directly about the downsides of doing a particular thing, they are more likely to choose a particular thing. This is part of the reason why sometimes doctors get a little bit worried about full informed consent, because they're like, gosh, I really think this is the right thing. But man, if I tell this patient about side effects, I bet he won't take this drug for me. And then it becomes about for me as the doctor rather than for the patient. And we sometimes get sucked into that. Well, in the time of a pandemic, when the risk and benefit calculus is disjointed, right? They're separated from each other. The benefit is not clearly evident, but the risk is there, especially if you get some bozo saying, oh yeah, if you wear a mask, your oxygen saturation will go down. You've been told now about a complication. It may not be accurate, but you've been told about a complication that you yourself might suffer. Putting that up against some theoretical benefit for some grandmother tucked away in a nursing home who is going to be hurt by you because you contact this person contacts this one, and then this person contacts that grandma, that multiple step process, that doesn't register with the human mind. But that direct threat of your oxygen saturation might go down, even if it's total horseshit, is much more salient. That's the way we're wired. We're vulnerable people that way. Despite our huge brains, we are creatures susceptible to that kind of bias. And as I talked about before, our sense of fairness matters. And so if you're frustrated by lots of folks walking around saying, you won't be telling me what to do, it isn't fair to me to make me do this, they're comparing themselves. Even though they're not saying it out loud, they're comparing themselves to someone else when they tell you that. And the someone else may be someone whom they long to be but could not be. And so that sense of fairness to them is really, it's more about having an instruction to do something, really highlighting what is unfair about the situation in general. It's unfair to ask anything of me. The world has already taken so much from me. How dare you ask one more thing of me? That's unfair. That kind of thing is hardwired into the way that our brains evolved and put us on this planet now. And so to ask us to transcend that is a pretty hard ask. And unfortunately, as Dave was talking about before, gosh, we'd love it if we could use information. But the data tell us that people don't really do a good job of saying, like, how much money will it cost me to go and get masks? How much money will it cost me to engage in this particular health behavior? How much time is it going to take? What is it going to do for my health? What is it going to do for the health of my family? We're actually not good at making tables and giving weights to things as a way to make decisions. It's just not how normal, and this is, again, we're back in the realm of normal people. We're not talking about brain damaged people or even people who have had terrible life traumas. We're talking about you and me and everybody else. We're not good at that. Our feelings really do matter too. And when I make a distinction between integral feelings and incidental feelings, what I mean is integral feelings are, how do you personally feel about the threat of the pandemic to you and the stress it places on your life when it comes to what decisions you might make? That's kind of obvious, like, how do you feel about it? How does it matter? But what's interesting is incidental emotions matter too. So what does that mean? That means if you decide, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have
something's not right. Wait a few minutes and try setting up again. You can also.
Hello? Okay. We're going to have a telephone campaign where we're just going to call people out of the blue and say, hey, we'd like to remind you, it would be really helpful if you just remember, stay 6 feet away from people, please wear a mask, things like that. What if that phone call comes minutes after the person who picks up the phone just got fired from their job because of this effing COVID, or just had a death in their family, or their dog just died, or something else really went wrong that isn't actually integral to the question of how do you feel about wearing a mask? How do you feel about sequestering away from large crowds during this time to try to keep down spread? It's not about that. It's about feelings about something else completely. It turns out that really good research says that if you are faced with a bad emotional situation right before you're asked to contend with a major choice, those emotions that you're feeling about that completely unrelated thing, they really do cloud what you decide to do about the situation in front of you. And that really matters. And how do those emotions affect things? Well, specifically, they actually change what you're able to think about. So, asking people to cognate, forget about it. They're less capable when their brains are offline emotionally. And then what they're likely to do, if they're in a fight or flight mode about the other thing that happened in their lives, they're more likely to make that reaction to the thing that you're asking of them to. So we have to be attuned to these things that we have to think about when we have conversations. And so even if you've got a long list of things that you want to get through, or a lot of people you want to call, I want to call as many people as possible. I'm going to win the award for I called the most people and told them to wear a mask. You're actually not doing a very good job if you're insisting that you get all of your script out of your mouth into that person's ear to the exclusion of understanding their experience first. If you caught them at a wrong time, and it's truly a wrong time, you have a much better chance of getting somewhere with that person if you can actually acknowledge they're having a bad time of it and ask them if there's anything that you could actually do for them. I know it seems crazy to be a stranger out of the blue making a cold call, but if somebody tells you, this is really an awful time, if you identify yourself as someone who would like to talk about COVID and how we're handling this, but you're more concerned about what's going on with them now, is there anything you can do for them? You have laid the groundwork for the possibility of that person actually hearing you, because you care about them, they might care about you and what you have to say. It seems like a crazy thing to do, but it actually has much more power in changing people's choices to relate first and then talk about information later. And that's the segue to my last main point. Relationship matters. The medium can literally be the message itself. What you say has much less to do with who you are to people. And we know this from medical literature. If you're interested, I have the resources at the end of the slides here. Things like your relationship with your oncologist has a heck of a lot more to do with what treatment you choose for cancer than whether or not that treatment is actually the right treatment for you. Like, we've done studies that say, objectively, this person with his cancer would do better with treatment A versus treatment B. But if that person has a really good relationship with an oncologist who then pushes treatment B instead of treatment A, he is very likely to take treatment B, even though it is not in his best interest. Now, obviously, the ethics of these studies, these are sham, right? So they were done, and then the exercise is broken, and then they are told, thank you for being part of a study, but really, you should do treatment A. But the relationship carries more power than the content of the suggested option, even when the content is like literally that trusted oncologist says, if you do this treatment, you have a 90% chance of having rip-roaring side effects and only a 10% chance of living longer. And then the other treatment is the other way around. You have a 90% chance of living longer and only 10% chance of problems. And then that same trusted oncologist looks that patient dead in the eye and says, I believe that the better treatment for you is B. I'm kidding you not. The results of the study say that the patient is more likely to take B, not in their best interest, because the relationship and the trust and the background that they have is more important than the content. So where am I going with this with recommendations? Remember that despite this huge brain that we've got, it's the little bits of it that sometimes rule the day, and they have inputs that are more powerful from years, from decades worth of living before we ever had COVID. People are coming into this as adults making choices now, not based on really their understanding of COVID, but based on the life that they lived before they ever got to this point. And so how are you going to help those people if you have a desperate need in the interest of public health, in your health, in their health, to try to get them to do something different? You got to remember that the parts of their brain that are operative are the same ones that remember things from long ago. And so it might be a good idea to talk to them about what they remember from long ago as a starting point to get to know them. Bodily states matter too, really critical, right? If we're talking about gut feelings, what if your state of physical well-being actually affects your choice? We could spend a whole other talk on that, but literally your own physical state of health can affect whether or not your gut feelings are reliable. Because if your gut feeling is relying on that vagus nerve activity that Sanjay was alluding to before, but you have belly problems, you have an ulcer, or you have problems with chronic constipation or other kinds of pains, you literally may be in a different state to be able to make a decision than you should normally be. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at the reality that if people don't feel terribly well, or they're not feeling very healthy, it's important to acknowledge that discomfort and try to do something about it before you ask somebody to make a decision. Because their decisions may literally be clouded by what their body is telling their mind to do. Be mindful of the context that you're working in, and realize that sometimes in order to get away from you, because you're trying to get them to listen to you, people will tell you that they will do one thing because they know that you're observing them, but then choose something different. This is a big deal. That's what apprehension bias is. In research, it's related to this issue of people behaving different in studies when they're being studied because they know they're being studied. By extension, that happens when people in a position of expertise say, you know, I have this information for you. Please take this seriously. Please do this. There's a significant portion of people who will, on the phone, will say to you, yeah, thank you very much. I'll do that. Great. I got to go. But then when left to their own devices to make choices, they don't change their behavior. And so if we're convinced by a simple interaction that somebody's going to do something that we want them to do, we may be fooling ourselves that we've made a difference. The real way to make a difference is to have a relationship first. That's got to come first. And this is why I'm arguing, despite the fact that I know we have options to disseminate information better and have influencers on our side and try to make a difference for large numbers of people, I think the best chance that we have to make a difference is actually to work in the lives of the small circle of people around each of us, spend intentional time with them, and really influence their lives first before we try to influence them to do something that we want. And that kind of influence really has to come in the form of openness to their experience before we start telling them what we want their experience to be. Some of you may have seen that there was I don't know when the story actually came out. It couldn't have been too long ago. There was a story on social media. I was trying to find it so that I could post it at the end here so you could see it. It was about an individual who set up a table outside of a rally, a conservative gathering where folks were discussing issues that are important to folks on the right side of the political spectrum. And a man undertook this project to simply go and be present. And he set up what he called a free listening experience. That's what he did. He set up a table and a chair and another chair for somebody else to sit down, and put up a sign. It just said free listening. And what he was offering was to hear from people what had brought them to where they were, why they had come to this rally, what the importance of their issues were, and things like that. And as you might imagine, this is somebody who lives on the left of the political spectrum because he's disposed to sort of collaborate and share and things like that. But he intentionally made his activity not about sharing of his perspective, but he really did what he was offering for free. I'm going to sit and I'm going to listen. So the woman came up to him and he said, so, can you tell me why you're here? And she said very loudly and very directly, I'm here because abortion is the absolute worst thing that is going on in this country. I can't believe we kill all these babies every stinking day. It's such an awful thing. It's terrible and we need to fix it. And, his blood started to shoot up, and he, because this isn't where he comes from on the political spectrum, and it's not what he thinks about. But instead of saying something about it and fighting about it, he asked more about where she had come from in order to get there, and asked her to share her story. And she told him about what it was like to be a young woman caught on the thorns of a dilemma between having a baby or not in a situation which was not ideal based on the situation of her life. And she was encouraged strongly by other authority figures in her life who were supposed to have her best interests at heart, who were supposed to be the caregivers who really understood her and really cared for her. They encouraged her to terminate her pregnancy. And as a result, she was very, very angry. She hated herself for it by extension, because after the decision was made and she moved on with her life, those authority figures, parents, weren't actually running her life for her later. And she was the only one left to be able to look in the mirror and ascribe responsibility for it. And so she was furious, and she had a reason to believe that this was the wrong thing to do. And she hated it. She hated herself for it. And she had an agenda. And so, the story doesn't come with a happy ending in the liberal sense of, like, I got a better outcome as a liberal person, because the author doesn't say, I changed her mind. What the author was able to, though, say for sure is that by not trying to use the opportunity for his agenda, he knows that that's a person who felt listened to, and he's confident that if they met each other again, they'd be able to talk again. And that is the start of something going in the right direction. So I would think seriously about that as an opportunity that might be available to all of us. So although we may all be really troubled by what we see in the media, and we're so bothered by all the misinformation and things not going right, I think that working locally and individually probably has more power if we all take on that project rather than all trying to beat our heads against the wall. And so those are some recommendations, because I don't know if those of you on the call who have read Blink, we are wired to make decisions automatically, quickly, based on patterns of previous experience. And everybody you meet now, whether they're making what looks like a right choice or a wrong choice, is actually making decisions in this moment based on a whole host of previous experiences that have framed their sense of what they expect out of the world. And even though the world is doing things to us now that we didn't expect, we're still trying to fit it into pre-existing categories. And so you can't really expect people to be different from who they have been up to this point. So you got to be with them first if you're going to find common ground. So I'll leave it there and see if we can continue in a productive way.
So JJ, that is just outstanding, completely eye-opening for me. I'm sure for many of us on this town hall. I think that right briefly before you began, I mean, maybe a day or so before this town hall, from my own observations, and I'm going to read it's what has turned out to be a laundry list instead of the 3 questions that I wanted to ask you. So, and that hopefully, I'm not going to ask for the answers to these. I'm going to throw them out there and then see if they resonate with the rest of the people who are joining us. And if they do, just tell us in the Q&A or the chat window, and then we can kind of sort through and address them. But what you finished on is that as influencers, I think, and I am guilty of this, we believe that we're far more powerful than we actually are. And I think social media gives us a false sense of power when we look at the number of likes or the number of followers or, on Twitter and et cetera. We feel like our voice is much, much louder than it is, really in its ultimate effect on people. then we're in for kind of a letdown when we don't end up convincing someone of our viewpoint. And 20 weeks into this, 21 weeks into engaging this way in town hall and in the resource page, I have not found one convert. You know what I'm saying? And I think that social media, is a kind of a false megaphone, and I really loved how you brought it down to a very personal level in terms of who we can reasonably expect to be able to influence, and that is people you are present with and are willing to be present with for the duration it takes for them to see you and for you to see them, and their state of emotions, and perspectives. So I really love that you were able to bring us all to that realization in the journey of your talk. There were moments where when you were speaking, it was a reminder of just how incredible you are as an intellectual, as a physician, as a researcher. I don't have enough compliments to give you, but I want to really thank you for everything that you brought us through and pointed out in the talk. Terry or Karen or any of the other panelists, my co-hosts here, want any observations that they want to state before I read this little thing? And hopefully this will resonate with people and they can say, yeah, definitely, JJ, answer that question, or can you give us some of your thoughts on that topic? But you guys go ahead first.
I don't know if it in general, it like raises questions or drives a statement. I mean, I sort of try to, the people who I'm around, I try to affect in a positive manner every day. It isn't like, you're butting heads, but you're seeking that commonality that you can put an idea across and build that bond, and you get a higher outcome out of every time you interact with that person. And so that's how I would think, like building into something, that's how you would do it. It isn't all at once. It may be over a period of time, but you can't get to that point.
Very true. Very true. Karen, you have anything you want to, any observation?
It just made me think about how, of course, I equate it to the work I do, which is organizing around the issue of healthcare. And it made me think about how I can talk to people about that issue. I already do have some really personal conversations with people. A lot of people tell me their terrible medical stories. So I do have kind of experience with connecting with people. And of course, one of the first things after they tell me one of their stories is I, immediately express sympathy for their situation. But eventually, my goal is to try and coach them to tell their story publicly. But I don't go right into that. I want to hear about it, and then I express sympathy for them. And that's meaningful. I'm not trying to be calculated. And then when I talk to people about the issue of, say, public option or Medicare for all, just approach them in a more listening kind of way, which as organizers, we're always taught to be about listening, and we should be 90% listening, 10% talking. But I thought about setting up like a Medicare for all table and just having it be a listening table.
Yeah.
So I thought that was kind of an interesting thought that came to me. But in terms of the pandemic, I have had definitely feelings. People were giving me feelings sometimes after I've had in-person conversations with them about them being skeptical of it all, I have felt like there's some trauma there after they walk away. I've had that feeling like not what's wrong with her, but what happened to her, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that's just something that really helped solidify, coalesce my thoughts, is hearing you talk about that.
Okay, that's excellent. Okay, so here's the laundry list. All right, so we've been starting off all of these town halls with the gathering evidence and trying to present evidence. Evidence as basic as counts, testing counts, positivity counts, where is there a hotspot, so to speak, and comparing it to other places. The resistance to evidence has been growing, it seems, not ebbing. It seems like there's so much about people not willing to trust the numbers. They're not willing to trust to the extent where I've even heard people express an unwillingness to get tested, even if they do get sick. If I get sick, I'm not going to get tested. I'll be fine at home. I don't need a test. Okay. And what is that, if that becomes a phenomenon, what does that mean to our public health initiatives to not have accuracy or precision when it comes to the number of people that get sick? Okay, that's one issue. So, how do you explain to someone that there is a best practice for the individual if you get sick? But I mean, it all ties back to what you said. It has to be done on a personal level. It's much, much harder, I think, unless you have a suggestion to how you do it en masse. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so that's one. The futility of arguing on social media. And I'm not sure fully of Karen's history, but I know Terry and I are grizzled old warriors when it comes to these battles. Okay. So, I mean, so I just want to I have learned, and even after learning the lesson that it's futile, I still engage in it. So that's an issue of going back and forth with people that, you're not going to convince them of anything. And it just devolves into blood sport. That's
Sanjay, I'll just quick interject and say that has actually resulted in you collecting us, right?
That is true. That is true. That has that infamy has resulted in people coming to these town halls on the resource page. So that is good. That is a good thing. Okay. Then the issue, if you have any recommendation on these platforms, on censorship versus free flow of information, because we have come across this and we've dealt with it in previous town halls about what you said, certain doctors with a vehement need to share their experience, maybe motivated by whatever, but we'll just say that, do they have a right to tell their story without being censored? Okay. Where is the line drawn in the public health sand, where someone's saying something anecdotally that actually has been refuted or has reasonable evidence to say that it's not good for the public to engage in this, a recommendation, even though the anecdote may indicate otherwise. Where's that line drawn? Because asking these platforms to regulate, to me, and I'm not being perhaps slightly facetious, but it's like asking Facebook and Twitter to regulate people to not be horrible or gullible people. I mean, and that is I wrote that down before I went through the process of your presentation. I would not say that again, nor if I had not gone through what I just went through with you, your presentation, I could still use those words without caution. But now I have in my mind a caution about using those words because of what you just taught me and taught us. Okay, so I'll just say that. There's frustration on both ends. Okay, one is an accusation that certain people's behaviors are prolonging the suffering of us all. And then there's the accusation that the public health recommendations are oppressive to most, even those who are not under high risk. And there are numbers to back. There's a business case on both ends of that argument. Okay, I'm just throwing this stuff out there, JJ. You don't have to answer any of these. I'm just throwing up questions for, topics for open discussion. And then that leads to all of these topics now lead to, what are we going to do about this? Are we in this for another year? Because it seems like we don't have the national will or the political action to bring this to a halt sooner rather than later. And as a result of that, people are all looking forward to the panacea of receiving a vaccination so that they can then re-enter society with a certain level of abandon. I'm not even going to call it confidence. So they can re-enter society, they can fly, they can go on vacation, they can do whatever they want to do because I've been vaccinated. And there's a third of those asked in recent survey are saying that they will not get vaccinated. Okay, and so we're facing another public health hurdle with that.
Well, so this issue was brought up in the chat by Lark Baum. You probably saw that typed out, right? That the timetable here, it is not reasonable to have a position that says, oh, come on, just hold on a little longer.
Yeah.
Oh, come on, just do this today or this week, or just do this without an endpoint, because it's not reasonable, noting what you said about the vaccine timetable and the reality of when that kind of hope would truly change the way that things are for us. So absent that, what I'm wishing for, although I confess, I don't have a step-by-step plan to try to operationalize it. But what I would like to see happen is for us to try to dive into, behind, within the demands that people have to just get back to life, or do things the way that they're used to, or otherwise engage in something that they're being told they can't or shouldn't or whatever, and have a mechanism to try to understand what that is about, rather than fighting about the practicality. In other words, like, I want to go bowling. No, you can't go bowling here. Bowling involves indoor activity, not a lot of good airflow, sticking your finger in the same balls together, licking your fingers, right, sharing pretzels, right? Like we've decided as quote unquote experts, this particular activity is not acceptable. Person who wants to go bowling says, that is what I want. Is there at least some fraction of the folks who are struggling with the imposition and its impact on their personal well-being, their mental health, their lives, who could be engaged to talk beyond the thing that they want to do, to try them to help to understand, and us along with them to understand, what is the function of this activity? And okay, some percentage of people will respond, I just like freaking bowling. And they'll dig in on like just the thing itself. Right. But my hope would be that there is a percentage of people and a percentage of activities that we can talk about in a truly meaningful way to get to the root of what they do for the individuals who have gotten to do them all their lives, so that we might be able to find an honest surrogate, not just like, oh, well, thanks, but you just can't do that. But say, well, if bowling does this thing for you, then can we create the experience of going to the alley in a different way, in a truly different way? We acknowledge that it's different, but it has the elements within it that you have been craving, right? That you want. you know. Yeah, okay. So, right. Or meeting somebody at the bowling alley so you can have sex with them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, because I mean, if I was 25 right now or 21 or whatever, this era sucks, right? It just sucks. You know, married with kids, with dogs, and, you know, most of my entertainment is right here. It's totally different circumstance. So I can see that. And I go back to what I said before, and we're probably going to have to close out and go to the true post show where we invite everybody in, if you don't mind. So we'll have John do that. But it goes back to people are missing an important portion of their life. And based on where they are in their life, they're missing that portion. And they have different frustration levels with what they're missing. For me, not being able to travel to my sister's house or get on a plane to go down and see my mom, it's frustrating, but I can deal with it versus a young person that may feel like they're missing out on meeting the person that they're meant to be with, or, you know, I'm just trying to put it.
Yes. Yeah, that's very good. And that is why some people are radically changing their previously established routines about how they relate. Like, for instance, there are some folks who are saying, I will meet a new person. I will give a sexual relationship a chance with somebody. What I will do is I will, you know, choose this person almost sight unseen in traditional ways,
Right.
But then decide that the two of us will quarantine together, right? And so we'll come to the situation having isolated before, presuming that we don't have the virus, and then the two of us will be with each other and then still be only with each other. It's taking a chance on a radically new way to launch a relationship and have certain kinds of activities and releases and all sorts of things. It's different, but it is a way. And
well, you're absolutely right. Now let's have John close out for us. Okay.
We do need to be creative, though, right? We need to be creative in our assessments of ourselves and of our possibilities, and truly be open to possibility that is not necessarily something that we thought was open to us before. I think that's a reasonable conclusion to that.
I mean, it could be a plus, right, JJ? Instead of a one-night stand, you got a 14-night stand.
All right. Fortnite, doesn't it?
Yeah. All right.
Thank
John,
you.
take it away.
Once again, we want to thank JJ and Sanjay and everyone for joining us tonight. If you're catching not the whole broadcast of this, it will be up on the Facebook page and on our YouTube channel in about 24 hours. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.